For over a decade, a vast majority of the public has been aware of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a shared film universe that connects four phases of live-action and animated movies and television shows, all based off of characters featured in the Marvel Comics library. This cinematic universe began with 2008's Iron Man and culminated with 2019's Avengers Endgame and is still ongoing, for better or worse. Arriving a little late to the Cinematic Universe party, DC Comics, aka Marvel's main rival, decided to throw their hat into the ring by kickstarting the so-called DC Extended Universe, with the 2009 release of Zack Snyder's epic Superman reboot entitled Man of Steel. The DCEU has had some bumps in the road in regards to audience reception, but there's no denying that the majority of their successes stem from the strategy of veering away from the family-friendly format of the MCU and instead embracing the historically more mature tone of the DC Comics of the 1930s, 80s, and 90s. Two such films in the DCEU are the drastically different live-action interpretations of the comic book called The Suicide Squad. The basic premise of the comic is this: shadowy government agent Amanda Waller and professional soldier Rick Flag create a special Black Ops team composed of some of the most dangerous criminals on the planet with special skills and powers who are capable of completing high-risk missions with low probability of success. In exchange for each successful mission, the team members get 10 years taken off any prison term they've accrued. The official designation of the team is Task Force X, but thanks to the high likelihood of death, it has been nicknamed the Suicide Squad. Basically, the Suicide Squad is a takeoff of the 1967 war film called The Dirty Dozen, where instead of garden variety murderers and thieves, the starting lineup is composed of DC Comics supervillains and anti-heroes like Deadshot, Bloodsport, Harley Quinn, Captain Boomerang, Peacemaker, King Shark, Killer Croc, etc. The first film, released in 2017, was simply titled Suicide Squad and was written and directed by David Ayer, who everyone probably knows best as the writer of Training Day. It covers the initial formation of the squad itself 2 years after the death of Superman, and the team's first mission to stop the magical Enchantress and her brother Incubus from destroying the planet. The reception to David Ayer's Suicide Squad was a bit, mixed, to say the least, and the film was apparently yet another victim of studio interference from former Warner Bros. CEO Walter Hamada, but we're not going to get into that. The second film, entitled The Suicide Squad, was released in 2021 and was written and directed by James Gunn. The story featured a new iteration of the squad on a mission to the island nation of Corto Maltese to destroy any trace of a diabolical weapons experiment that puts them in the conflict with the giant extraterrestrial starfish called Starro. The second film was way wackier than the first film thanks to James Gunn's trademark dark humor, but it was loads more entertaining and really won over new fans that weren't too crazy about the first film. Good or bad, the Suicide Squad is a decent intellectual property for Warner Brothers to exploit and or profit from. But did you know that there was an actual team of the same name? No joking, ladies and gents, there was indeed a real-life Suicide Squad, and their mission was infinitely more dangerous than anything dreamed up by the writers of the comic book, and the fate of no less than 44 countries depended on their success. Hang on tight, everyone, because I'm going to relate to you the harrowing true story of the real Suicide Squad. It all began in the early morning hours of April 26, 1986 in the Ukrainian town of Pripyat. Most of the city's residents were sleeping peacefully in their beds without a care in the world. 2 miles away at the nearby Vladimir I. Lenin nuclear power station, the night shift was preparing to perform a safety test for their number 4 RBMK reactor. The purpose of the test was to check to see if their newly instituted power failure procedure could allow the number 4 reactor to remain operational in the event of an unplanned power outage. It all seemed like a fairly routine situation. However, it was truly anything but, because the Vladimir I. Lenin nuclear power station also had another name that would become forever embedded into the public consciousness for the worst possible reason: Chernobyl. At 1:23 a.m., the night shift crew at Chernobyl initiated their safety test as planned, and nearly 40 seconds later, all hell broke loose. Thanks to what would later be determined to be a combination of human error, faulty engineering, and bureaucratic incompetence, the safety test caused a sudden spike in the power output, quickly followed by a massive explosion that literally tore the roof off of the reactor building. Perhaps due to a mixture of shock, denial, and arrogance, the on-duty plant personnel, specifically Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, assumed that what had happened was that hydrogen had accumulated inside an emergency storage tank in the reactor building, and then exploded due to a temperature increase caused by the sudden power spike, and scrambled to try to get coolant into the number 4 reactor before a meltdown began. But the technicians inside the reactor building knew the horrifying truth. It wasn't the emergency tank that exploded. It was reactor number 4 itself, and the core had already started to melt down. Within hours, fire crews, plant management, and local Communist Party leaders converged on Chernobyl. The firefighters, unaware that they were exposing themselves to fatal amounts of radiation, ferociously attacked the blaze with fire hoses in an effort to put it out. But considering that it was a self-sustaining nuclear reaction that they were fighting instead of a conventional fire, it was a losing battle that would ultimately claim the lives of nearly every first responder on the scene that morning. Meanwhile, in a conference room on site, plant manager Viktor Bryukhanov, chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, and party leaders were discussing the emergency, and while most adamantly maintained that the situation wasn't serious at all, there was some opposition in the room that was rightfully concerned. However, the delusion of invincibility that defined most citizens of the Soviet Union overcame their common sense and prompted them to simply keep their mouths shut to the general public and try to fix the problem themselves in order to protect their reputations and the image of the Soviet government. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev had received word of the accident at Chernobyl and was told by the on-site personnel that the situation was under control and that there was nothing to worry about. They even boldly claimed that reactor number 4 would be back online within a matter of months. While President Gorbachev was relieved to hear the optimistic assessment, he still wasn't 100% convinced that things were going that smoothly. So to dot his I's and cross his T's, President Gorbachev put together an investigative committee to look into the accident. And while there were some people who did agree with the plant management's assessment, like Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministers Boris Sherbina, there were other experts like Valery Legasov of the Academy of Sciences who were quite alarmed by the accident due to numerous concerns being raised about the inherent design flaws of the RBMK reactors like the ones at Chernobyl in the years following their construction. With no consensus about the true status of the plant, President Gorbachev made the decision to send Legasov and Sherbina to Chernobyl, along with military personnel and agents of the KGB, to find out just what the hell was going on down there. Upon arriving at Chernobyl, Legasov and Sherbina were bombarded by denials from Bryukhanov and Fomin that anything serious was going on, citing that dosimeter readings all across the site indicated a maximum ionizing radiation level of 3.6 Rontgen per hour in the hardest hit areas. An instantly fatal dose is 100,000 Rontgen per hour, so in other words, the radiation level wasn't great, but not horrible either. However, the committee immediately pointed out a major flaw in that conclusion. The civilian-made dosimeters that the plant staff were using were reading 3.6 Rontgen per hour because they're designed to max out at 3.6 Rontgen per hour. So the readings weren't exactly what one would call 100% reliable. One of the military leaders present, General Vladimir Pikolov of the Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Protection Troops, produced a military-grade dosimeter, and after donning a lead-lined suit and climbing into the driver's seat of a crudely insulated truck, he drove at high speed all the way up to the reactor building itself to get a more accurate reading. When General Pikolov returned minutes later, the news was not what the committee had wanted to hear. The maximum ionizing radiation count was not 3.6 Rontgen per hour like Bryukhanov and Fomin led everyone to believe. It was over 15,000 Rontgen per hour. Putting those numbers into perspective, in the hours following the initial explosion, the entire Chernobyl site, as well as the nearby city of Pripyat with its 50,000 citizens, had been exposed to a level of ionizing radiation equivalent to over 40 times the amount dispersed by the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The situation wasn't bad. It was apocalyptic. Realizing that they were now facing one of the worst nuclear disasters in history, Sherbeta and Legasov immediately got to work addressing the problem. After firing Bryukhanov and Fomin on the spot, they turned their attention to putting out the fire in reactor number 4 that was still burning. With full support from President Gorbachev, the cleanup crew, known today as the Chernobyl Liquidators, began dropping several thousand tons of sand and boron from helicopters onto the burning reactor to smother the blaze, since water would be of no use. Now, they couldn't fly directly over the reactor itself due to the beyond lethal amounts of ionizing radiation being shot up into the atmosphere, so they had to approach from an angle and let the wind carry the payload onto the target. It was both time-consuming and extraordinarily difficult, but it was the only way to do so without killing the helicopter crews outright. Over 36 hours after the explosion, President Gorbachev finally gave the order to evacuate the city of Pripyat after traces of ionizing radiation from reactor number 4 were found as far away as Germany and Switzerland, meaning that the entire world now knew about the accident. 50,000 people were loaded up into buses with everything they could carry and driven away, with a 26-mile exclusion zone being set up behind them, transforming the bustling workers' paradise into a permanent ghost town. A week passed, and while progress was being made on extinguishing the fire, a new problem emerged. As a side effect of the airdrops to put out the fire, the remains of the graphite neutron flux modulators that the reactor core was comprised of began to heat up to almost 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, melting the surrounding concrete with it and creating effectively a blob of radioactive lava that began to melt through the reactor floor. Eventually, the lava would continue to melt its way through the ground, penetrating the plant's biological shield and entering the groundwater, which would heavily contaminate the water and food supply for several neighboring countries and drastically impact millions of citizens living within those countries. It was a scenario that Legasov anticipated from the very beginning, but he also knew that it would take at least a couple of months before the lava would reach the groundwater, which meant that they had some time to figure out how to neutralize the problem. But after some calculations by consultants assisting with the cleanup efforts, Legasov discovered that a far more dangerous problem had arisen. Directly under the reactor building were 2 floors of what were called bubbler pools. Basically, a bubbler pool was a reservoir full of water that could act as a backup for the reactor cooling system should it fail catastrophically, which it sort of did during the explosion. Now, the big reason why the bubbler pools underneath reactor 4 were a potential problem was because if there was a sufficient amount of water left in them, then the radioactive magma in the reactor vessel directly above could cause a massive steam explosion when the superheated material came into contact with the water. And another explosion at Chernobyl was something that nobody wanted. Fortunately, though, Legasov had already read the statements made by plant personnel that just after the explosion, they immediately ran down to the bubbler pools and began manually feeding water into reactor 4 as a last-ditch effort to cool down the burning core. So according to those statements, the bubbler pools should have been empty. But then the liquidators realized something that everyone had overlooked. When the explosion occurred, the concussion wave had caused nearly every water pipe in the reactor building to burst, and all of that stored water to run down through the building and into the bubbler pools themselves. Additionally, during that 36-hour period following the explosion, fire hoses that had been utilized by the firefighters responding to the incident had been left running, and all of that water was flowing into storm drains that fed directly into the bubbler pools, which meant that it was very likely that the bubbler pools were full. Experts at the time estimated that if the radioactive magma hit the estimated 5 million gallons of water in the bubbler pools and caused the steam explosion they feared, it would be a blast measuring somewhere between 3 to 5 megatons of TNT. The radioactive fallout would be dispersed in every direction for hundreds of miles, and the blast could also potentially damage or destroy the nearby number 1, 2, and 3 RBMK reactors at Chernobyl, which were still functioning. If the Chernobyl plant exploded for a second time, then the nearby city of Kiev, over 100 miles away, would have been turned into a mountain of rubble. The radioactive fallout would have been widely spread across the continent by the wind, and the majority of Europe would have been rendered completely uninhabitable for at least 100,000 years. In a nutshell, a catastrophic event was about to occur that would kill millions of people, as well as adversely affect the lives of millions more, and this was about to occur within a matter of days. But Legasov already had a plan, and it was relatively simple. In order to negate the threat of the steam explosion, the liquidators would simply run hoses into the bubbler pools, and using fire trucks they would pump the water out. However, to gain access to the bubbler pools, they would need to open a set of sluice gates leading into the basement area of the reactor building. Now, the automatic controls for the sluice gates were damaged beyond repair during the explosion, so they would have to use the manual controls to get them open. And those controls were located in the basement of an adjoining building that was flooded with highly contaminated water. Realizing that they couldn't afford to waste time sending someone into the flooded basement who was unfamiliar with the layout, and that anyone they send down there would likely die due to the high levels of radiation, Legasov and Sherbina reached out to the entire staff of the Chernobyl plant and had an emergency meeting. Now, Legasov and Sherbina explained the situation to the workers and told them that they needed the help of at least 3 men who knew the basement layout and how to operate the sluice gate controls. Legasov and Sherbina also stated that whoever volunteered for the task would be granted a yearly stipend of 400 rubles and the choice of whichever job that they would want in the nuclear industry. In a nutshell, Legasov and Sherbina were asking 3 men to effectively volunteer to die for practically nothing. There was a solemn atmosphere in that room. But the silence was broken when a man named Alexei Ananenko stood up and volunteered. Seconds later, 2 other men stood up and volunteered. Their names were Valery Bezpalov and Boris Baranov. These 3 men would go down in history as the real Suicide Squad. On May 4th, 8 days after the explosion, the Chernobyl liquidators helped Ananenko, Bezpalov, and Baranov get dressed into wetsuits, with lead-lined suits over top of them. They were also given flashlights as well as military-grade dosimeters to monitor their radiation exposure as they made their way to the sluice gate controls. The 3 men entered the basement of the adjoining building and disappeared into the darkness. It was a slow and stressful journey due to the near-total darkness, the confusing labyrinth of pipes made worse by damage from the explosion, and the constant ticking of the dosimeter. The only saving grace for the trio was that the water level was only knee-deep, which made their pace much quicker than they were expecting. As the 3 men slowly made their way through the dark basement, they were most likely pondering the same grim thought that every liquidator topside was. If they got lost and couldn't find those controls, then the fate of Europe itself would be sealed, and that basement would become their tomb. But luckily, one of the 3 men spotted something in the beam of his flashlight that put a pep in their step. He had caught sight of a color-coded section of pipes that he knew would lead them to the location of the sluice gate controls if they followed it. With newfound energy, the trio picked up their pace and followed the pipes. Eventually, they found the controls and immediately set to work trying to get the gates open. It took some doing, considering that the controls were a bit stuck due to lack of use, but they soon came free. Back topside, the liquidators were anxiously waiting for news when suddenly they heard the groaning and creaking of the sluice gates as they slowly crept open. In that instant, they knew that Ananenko, Bezpalov, and Baranov had reached the controls and began to breathe a sigh of relief. When the sluice gates were opened all the way, the liquidators ran the hoses into the reactor building, straight to the bubbler pools, and immediately started pumping the water out. The situation was under control at last. But what about Ananenko, Bezpalov, and Baranov? For several tense minutes, the liquidators watched the basement door with a sharp gaze, wondering if there was any hope at all that the 3 men were still alive. Moments later, the 3 men emerged from the basement and were greeted by the sounds of cheering and applause as some of the liquidators lifted them up onto their shoulders and carried them around. They weren't just ordinary plant workers anymore. They were heroes. It would be reported for years after their dangerous mission that Ananenko, Bezpalov, and Baranov tragically perished from acute radiation sickness weeks later. But the truth is no, they didn't. By some miracle, the real Suicide Squad survived their radiation exposure and went on to live long and productive lives for years to come. As of 2021, Alexei Onanenko and Valery Bespalov were still alive and still working in the nuclear industry. Boris Baranov sadly passed away in 2005 of a heart attack at the age of 65. The remainder of the cleanup operation at Chernobyl would continue for the rest of the year after the Real Suicide Squad completed their mission. The fire in reactor number 4 would be extinguished on May 6th, exactly 10 days after the explosion. On May 8th, the liquidators finished pumping the rest of the water out of the bubbler pools, thereby neutralizing the threat of the steam explosion, and by June 23rd, the foundation of the reactor building itself would be reinforced by an extra layer of concrete poured directly underneath thanks to a Ukrainian mining crew that provided their services, ensuring that the radioactive lava would never reach the groundwater before cooling down and solidifying completely. After that stage of the operation was completed, Legasov and Sherbina's attention turned to cleaning up the 100 tons of highly radioactive graphite fragments off the roof of the reactor building, which took months and hundreds of workers to complete. By late November, a massive concrete lead sarcophagus was erected over the entirety of reactor number 4 to prevent any further radioactive fallout from escaping. The cleanup was over, but it was only when the sole remaining functional RBMK reactor at Chernobyl was shut down and decommissioned on December 15, 2000, that the immediate threat of Chernobyl was considered to be over. When all was said and done, the disaster and subsequent cleanup and decontamination at Chernobyl cost over $68 billion in today's money and took over 500,000 liquidators to complete. Less than 100 deaths were determined to be directly caused by the disaster, with close to 4,000 to 40,000 people dying of radiation-related cancers caused by the fallout spread by the wind. In terms of accountability, former Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, former Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin, and former plant manager Viktor Bryukhanov were selected to pay the price for the Chernobyl disaster. All 3 men were put on trial for their actions before, during, and after the explosion, with the official charges being criminal mismanagement and gross violation of safety protocols. They were all found guilty and given the maximum sentence applicable, 10 years in a Soviet labor camp. Valery Legasov tragically took his own life at the age of 51, exactly 2 years after the disaster. Some attribute his suicide to guilt over being unable to convince the Soviet government to overhaul its policies regarding the nuclear industry so that another disaster like Chernobyl could be avoided. Boris Sherbina sadly passed away in 1990 at the age of 70, although it's still unclear whether it was due to natural causes or an illness caused by his radiation exposure at Chernobyl. Sometime before his death, Sherbina made a statement where he considered Legasov as one of his dearest friends and the one who did more to mitigate the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster than anyone else present. As for the Real Suicide Squad and the Chernobyl liquidators, they received modest financial compensation for their sacrifice, as well as the highest commendations awarded by the Soviet and post-Soviet government, and most importantly, the thanks of an entire continent whom they saved from certain death and destruction. So there you have it. The extraordinary tale of an earth-shattering disaster, the stubborn and opinionated men who helped cause it, and the brave and selfless men who risked everything to save the day. But it should also serve as a cautionary tale of why a potentially deadly force of nature and hubris should never coincide with one another when human lives are at stake. If you like this video, please show your support by dropping a comment below, hitting the like button, and sharing it with your friends. If you're curious about my future content and want to hear more extraordinary tales, then please subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload something new. Until next time, have a lovely day, stay safe out there, and most importantly, look for the extraordinary!